There are many nuances to classes in Dragon Quest III HD, so many in fact that nobody has gotten close to discussing them. Breaking it down into a tier list or similar surface level format just doesn't cut it. So that's where this behemoth of a video comes in. Maybe not in terms of runtime, but in the amount of information I'm going to shove into it. I am aiming to explain everything there is to know instead of providing a cookie cutter party. I want to give you the toolset to make your own informed decisions and plan out playthroughs for yourself, even with minimal prior knowledge. I'll go in depth on specific interactions and how party members perform in different practical contexts. And afterwards you should be able to decide what classes you want to use based on what you want from the game and your own personal playstyle. But then also what personalities you want to go alongside them, what to reclass into, what seeds are worth giving them in what contexts. And you should have a deeper understanding of their spells, abilities and specific traits like stats or critical modifiers, so you will have much more success with actually using anyone you add to your party. And even if you're in the middle of a playthrough and looking for what to reclass into, after watching this video you should be able to make better decisions. As a side note, in case you don't know, abilities carry over after reclassing and so do half your stats. I just want to get this out of the way so there's no confusion. The focus of this guide will be on the main game. High amounts of grinding in the post-game take away from the importance of each decision and all characters start blending together. It also becomes very goal-oriented, which as I've said before leads to players ignoring the entire game to have a strong party at the very end. I might do a video on post-game, but this one will at most glance at it. There are also somewhat meaningful mechanics that I don't want to go over. Things like base stat differences between body types, like how damage calculations cap your attack at 850 despite displaying higher numbers, and like how bonus stats from seeds don't get halved when you reclass, they just aren't worth mentioning, even though they technically do affect your character. But this guide aims to be practical. For any type of playthrough, so everything between very optimized ones where you want to 100% everything and very no nonsense ones where you rush through the game in 6 hours. But the focus is on practicality, which is why I'm excluding the aforementioned things that don't make a difference in practice. But yes, I did use those specific examples to at least have mentioned them in this video, which I feel is a good compromise. And to set the stage for how the rest of this video will go, I feel it is best to start with the most important class in the game, maybe besides the hero that I will talk more about at the end of the video. The Thief. This might come as a surprise to some of you, given how the Thief doesn't seem to give anything necessary. When people think about things that are required in a JRPG, they think about damage dealers, healers and so on. But what Thieves provide goes much deeper than that. Their abilities are split into 3 categories: disruption, damage and utility. Utility is the main reason why you're going to use a thief besides the high agility stat. They learn 3 important abilities/spells. Nose for Treasure tells you how much treasure is on any given floor, meaning you will never miss any. Snoop then lights up items on the ground, meaning you will take a reasonable amount of time to find anything. In the old games, those by themselves meant that you could 100% the game without a guide, but thanks to the inclusion of secret spots, that's no longer that simple. They do still change how you explore any location for the better, making the entire game just flow. But even more important than those two is our Lord and Savior, Padfoot. It's an ability that reduces the encounter rate almost down to 0, and that by itself might not give you a tangible benefit in combat. But this game requires minimal grinding either way, and the grinding that you do want to do is better done in separate grinding sessions. But more importantly, not having random encounters and being able to explore dungeons as well as the world without any worry is more fun. Try using a thief once and you will never want to go back to trotting through late game dungeons without Padfoot. But besides those 3, the thieves have more abilities that are much less notable. Assassin Stab is probably the best one I haven't talked about yet. It's an ability that can instantly kill any enemy, and since it can instantly kill metal slimes, it does help you grind. Propeller Blade is an ability that does almost reasonable damage for exactly 1 dungeon after you learn it before falling off a cliff. And the other damaging ability, Persecutor, as well as the abilities that apply a status effect on the attack, including Assassin Stab, suffer from one little problem. Thieves don't have a real strength stat. To apply a status effect, you first need to hit, but even if you have a strong thief, There are just better ways of applying status effects, for example items like the snooze sticks that can be found in the underground lake or bought in a sham. If you check out the first link below, it lists all the stats of characters at level 99, but that doesn't tell the full story. Warriors or fighters get very low amounts of strength on later levels. Their strength is very front loaded. Thieves start getting more strength at later levels, so it looks like thieves, wranglers and merchants aren't that far off. But that's deceiving. Either way, I'm getting ahead of myself. Persecutor does 6 times normal damage to sleeping or confused enemies, but 6 times 0 is still 0. Hypno Whip is a group targeting attack that can inflict confusion, again only if it inflicts damage. And then lastly you get what equates to a basic attack that either inflicts paralysis or sleep. The odds are terrible and I believe that every one of these abilities are bordering on useless outside of post-game. At face value you might consider reclassing a thief into a class with high strength, or reclassing a class with high strength to a thief for those abilities. But while this might be viable for post-game, balancing within the main game, especially on Draconian, favors attacks that ignore defense. Since the old strength cap has been raised and since you get all these new physical abilities, enemy stats compensate for that. Now that the hero learns Falcon Slash, the game is balanced with that as the new norm, and as such, kinda alright physical attack is not going to get you anywhere. I'll talk about this more when the Gardabout comes up, but the effort that it takes to make someone with low strength viable as a physical damage dealer is not worth the payoff. But before I get to how to best utilize a thief, there are 2 more abilities to talk about: Sandstorm and Backdraft. Dazzle is the worst status effect, but it works well enough against some bosses. It gets replaced by an item, the Sandstorm Spear, before long, and Coagulant or a Snooze Stick are better options against most bosses. In this game, confusion works guaranteed. There's never a chance of a confused enemy attacking you. Even if you remove the confusion in the middle of a turn, they will simply not act. The same goes for asleep enemies. Dazzle on the other hand can fail and it only prevents certain types of attacks. Even so, it's decent against the boss troll and the Bones of Barrowmouse, but other status effects are better against the boss troll. And by the time you're fighting the Bones of Barrowmouse, you can double cast Dazzle by wearing the duplicate, an item that you can pick up as soon as you get access to Ramia. That's a lot of words to say that Sandstorm is garbage, but Backdraft is a bit more nuanced. You only learn it at level 33, a level at which you could have very well already beaten the main game. But what it does is that it reflects all breath attacks that would hit that one party member. Theoretically you could use it with a warrior, then use forbearance on the next turn, maybe even apply bounce on them, and that makes you borderline unkillable. I see it more as a gimmick, but being able to reflect status breaths is neat. In post-game it also loses a lot of value since the only relevant fights left in post-game are timed and the goal is to win as quickly as possible. So overall it's not worth getting, just like Persecutor or Hypno Whip. The way I recommend utilizing a thief if you start with one is to give them a bunch of herbs early on. The hero with a boomerang is going to kill all enemies in 1 to 2 turns either way. It might help to give your thief one of the early boomerangs or whips, but around the pyramid, even an edge boomerang won't do any meaningful damage without a strength personality. At this point I recommend getting a snooze stick, either the one from the lake or one from a sham. As a side note, sell equipment and items you don't need. Getting them back later would be way easier if you did ever decide that you do need another copper sword after all. You will be able to afford any key piece of equipment without farming for money that way. And if you do get a snooze stick, a party member that goes first and puts an enemy to sleep is surprisingly good. And I mean all the way through the game. Even if bosses only sleep for 1 turn, taking that 1 turn away from them is huge. And even if it doesn't let you kill a group of enemies faster, the goal of a random battle isn't just to win, it is to get hit as little as possible. And that's basically what a thief will be doing after the very beginning, where you might still have some hope that they'll do decent damage. Then at level 20 I recommend reclassing them immediately, since they will already have all their relevant abilities. If they have low wisdom, then they might need to go to level 21 for Snoop. I still recommend getting that. Either way, good options are Sage, Priest, Mage and Monster Wrangler. To a lesser extent you can also reclass them into any other class. The benefit of having been a thief is that your entire party is better off thanks to the utility, well, specifically Padfoot. Their agility is also so high, I mean many times that of other classes, that anyone that was a thief with an agility boosting personality before reclassing will be able to outspeed for the rest of their natural life, meaning until you beat the base game. Bad Out of Hell is one of the best personalities, not just for thieves but anyone you don't want to give a meteorite bracer to. And especially if you're using Thief as a starter class, this results in the highest amount of bonus stats. Then after reclassing you can switch it depending on the class you go into. When looking for alternative personalities, the main stats to look out for are Vitality and to a lesser extent Resilience, and of course Agility. The others depend on what you want to reclass into and the role you want them to fill in your party. So for example, thieves that go into Monster Wrangler might want to consider Vamp or Genius to alleviate the MP problems you would face if they were your only damage dealer. Which isn't a very practical example, but on the topic of things that aren't practical, I think reclassing to Thief has very limited utility. It does give you a massive agility boost, so if you already farmed a priest up to level 33 to learn multi-heal, you might be tempted to reclass into Thief. But at that point in the main game, you're better off not reclassing that character to save yourself the grind back up from level 1. The only ability based class that might consider reclassing into Thief, since it gets the abilities at lower levels, is Monster Wrangler. They can reclass into anything and be fine. To be honest, they can even not reclass and still dominate the game. At this point, that's what I want to talk about. The Monster Wrangler. Wranglers at peak performance are the best damage dealer in the game. You've been watching this clip of a Barrowmouse fight for a while now, where I spam the Wrangler's main ability, Monster Pile On, which they learn after finding 10 monsters. It deals damage to 4 randomly chosen targets and it scales with how many monsters you found. I'll explain this more in a bit, but a party member that does a very high amount of defense piercing damage is a balancing nightmare. Slightly higher damage doesn't change how the game works, but if you kill a boss in not 8 but in 3 or 4 turns, then it gets a bit ridiculous. I did an entire playthrough with 2 Monster Wranglers that never reclassed and a Thief that went Sage because I'm addicted to Padfoot. And in that playthrough I gathered all the monsters and finished after a bit over 10 hours. So a tad on the long side, but it levels in the low 30s. The entire run felt like one of those hydraulic press videos. Stats, equipment, other abilities and so on, Wranglers stand above all that. They do so much damage that it trivializes everything in the game. And since it doesn't scale with anything, it doesn't matter how you prepare or what the game throws at you, at least as long as you outspeed, which is why I recommend Bad Out of Hell. If you're only using one Wrangler, then a wisdom or even stamina increase might be nice, but with 2 of them, fights end so quickly that other stats don't matter. I mentioned Wranglers and Thieves first for a simple reason. They are the foundation of any completionist playthrough. If you're the type of player that wants to find every piece of loot, every mini medal, every monster, and you want to explore every nook of every dungeon, or in other words, if you want to do post game which is locked behind doing all that, then you're going to have a much better time if you're using Padfoot, Snoop and the Monster Wrangler's passive ability. Recruitable monsters exist in this game, and when you get close to them, some run away, meaning you have to reload the area and then use an ability like Padfoot so they don't hear your footsteps, or Fade to turn invisible so they don't see you coming, something like that before you tame them. And if they run away, that's super annoying. Unless you have a Monster Wrangler in your party, they make it so that monsters will never run away from you. So if you want to engage with the arena/monster wrangling side quest, then having a Monster Wrangler becomes really useful. And equally, a Monster Wrangler is powered by engaging with the Monster Wrangling side quest. It's hard to make a tier list for this game, because a Wrangler is only good if you engage with that side quest. Other parties don't have to engage with it. It's harder for them and they only gain a minimal reward from it. But those playthroughs are much shorter, usually only 6 to 8 hours. The same goes for the Thief. If you want to get all mini medals, then being able to make the ones that are invisibly on the ground visible is basically mandatory unless you want to be glued to a guide, and even if you're glued to a guide or if you've just memorized all the locations, being able to get there without random encounters is a godsend. Remember when I mentioned that I wouldn't give you cookie cutter parties? Well, that's not entirely true. I do think I have a recommendation or two. If you want to 100% the game as smoothly as possible, then you should start with a thief to grab all the abilities, and you should always have at least one monster wrangler in your party. Thieves also work for any other sort of playthrough, and I honestly think they're the closest thing there is to an auto-include. And you can of course not 100% the game but still collect all monsters and use monster wranglers efficiently. So that's the bottom line when it comes to using them. But they technically do have other abilities besides passively reducing annoyance and mushing up bosses in seconds. Call of the Wild hits 4 random enemies for about 15 damage. This is really good when you first get it after collecting only 2 more monsters after the mandatory slime. But it also falls off quickly. It's practically their basic attack, but gets replaced by Monster Pylon after only recruiting 10. These work well against bosses of course, but even in random encounters, it's great to use one of those after an AoE to finish off all the remaining enemies. If you have the hero with an edged boomerang early on, make sure to give them the meteorite bracer and maybe even a skull ring or seeds etc. to make sure they go before your wrangler. Using either of the monster wrangler's abilities on a full field of enemies is not that great. Even if Monster Pile-On will outdamage most of your AoE options when it comes to the total damage dealt. Wild Sight is learned after 50 monsters and it lets you act twice for the next 1 to 3 turns, for an average of 2. This means you get 4 attacks instead of 3 over the next 3 turns. If there wasn't anything as oppressive to use twice, the ability wouldn't be that great. You can only use the same ability twice, so you lose flexibility, i.e. casting Wild Sight and then double casting Magic Barrier is worse than casting Magic Barrier, already having it on the first turn and then being able to do whatever on the second. You don't need Wild Sight on every party member, especially not in the main game, and in post game you can clear all the turn counts with Monster Pylon plus Wild Sight on only 2 people. 50 monsters are available pretty early on, so you will also get this ability early on, and I recommend only reclassing afterwards. If you're using Wranglers, you will probably hit 50 monsters at around the same time as level 20 anyways. But the next rewards are not that great. At 80 monsters you get Focus Pocus, an ability that restores your MP slowly, but that's completely useless. The game litters you with MP restoring items that are all faster and better. It also hands out so many refills from level ups and all the MP restoring items, I just don't see a point. And the ultimate ability at 100 monsters is Fog of War, which I find interesting. It's a move that some bosses use against you that prevents all spells from both you and the enemy, which mostly means all good healing options. But you are usually more reliant on spells than the bosses are. Again, it's something that the final postgame boss uses, and there aren't many bosses that exclusively use spells. And ones like Barrowmouse that this would be interesting for are placed before you can get 100 monsters. This is one of the few abilities in the game that I can't judge fully, because I'm sure there's some jank here. Maybe you can transfer a Wrangler with the ability to an early game save, but I don't want to include that in my guide. Be some use for this, but I haven't found one yet. But Wranglers learn some abilities from leveling. Animal Instinct lets you know whether there's a monster in your vicinity, and depending on the text it tells you whether it's on the same screen as you are or whether it's 1 to 2 loading screens away. Attack Attacker is a neat debuff. The blunt spell doesn't exist in this game, making this the only real way of reducing enemy attack, but similar to the problems that thieves were facing, monster wranglers don't really have a viable attack stat, which means that this ability as well as Lashings of Love, which you get at 30 monsters collected, are borderline useless. And all the other abilities fall into one of 3 categories: healing, stuns or AoE damage. The healing abilities both suck. They are outperformed by common healing items from the moment you get them. I don't see any point in either of them. The only case I can imagine is when you forgot to buy herbs and have some MP to spare, so you end up putting a single enemy to sleep over and over again while spamming soothing song or emergency groom. But in most cases, instead of healing, you should rather prevent new damage from coming in by killing things. The AoE damage is all pretty awful, nothing comes close to monster pile on and you learn them way too late for them to matter. You get Cold Breath, which does about 140 damage at around level 44. Meanwhile, mages learn Wrangler at level 34 or Kaboom at 38. Level 44 is of course not realistic for the main game, but even the earlier abilities like Flame Breath at level 23 are only really there as a formality. Flame Breath does around 35 damage compared to Mage's Boom that does upwards of 60 damage, which they learn at the same level. And that leaves the stuns, and they are all pretty good. Tongue Bashing works wonders on bosses and the others are decent for random encounters. But at the end of the day, you don't want to use them unless it's absolutely necessary to survive, because else you would be missing out on all the damage that you get from monster pile on. So to make this short, the way you use a monster Wrangler is that you collect all monsters, who would have guessed, and then use monster pile on. Then after getting 50 monsters you can start using Wildside against bosses, just don't bother in random encounters, and sometimes you can even skip using it in a boss fight, it just depends on the situation. Afterwards you reclass to any of the other classes for extra utility or stats. The one I recommend most is Thief if you aren't outspeeding yet, but if you're already outspeeding, just make your Wrangler into something that still outspeeds. That's why I can't recommend Warrior, they're just too slow. And for personalities I of course recommend Bat Out of Hell above all else. That is because the perfect battle is one where you outspeed and win before any enemy acts without using MP. And while it does take some MP, this will get you the closest to that ideal scenario. In the same vein, anyone can reclass into Wrangler and get the ability to act twice. Physical attackers will struggle a bit with their attack, but during post game it's still going to be alright, and during the main game you won't attack physically either way, but instead rely on monster pile on. Again, I want to remind you, Wranglers that don't reclass are still more than enough to curbstorm Soma into oblivion. They might need to start wearing agile gillets near the end to outspeed reliably, but they really do make for one easy playthrough. So it's only appropriate of me to start talking about what doesn't make for an easy playthrough. The Martial Artist. This used to be the strongest class in the game in the old versions. One very dominant strategy was not using 2 Wranglers, but instead 2 Martial Artists and reclassing one while letting the other use the Golden Claw. And the Golden Claw used to be really relevant since it made a Martial Artist go from good to amazing. They were buffed a lot in this version. They have new flashy abilities with damage multipliers and there's so much extra gear for them to wear. You know, they used to deal pretty alright damage while unarmed, at least early on, and now they get so many strong weapons. So why is it that they deal so little damage? I mentioned it earlier, but the game is balanced around optimized martial artists and warriors that deal tons of damage after you reclass them twice, cast them 3 times, apply oomph, use the best equipment, have a good strength personality, and you EV train them or whatever. But the bottom line is that multipliers make everything a bit harder to balance. If a thief does 6 times normal damage, this makes damage calculations a bit hard. If you only have 50 extra attack, that would result in 150 extra damage with the old damage calculations. Of course those aren't entirely accurate anymore, but more importantly I believe that this led to enemies being balanced around pretty high levels and equally high attack stats. Defense stats are so high that you won't really start doing okay with physical attacks with anyone besides a Paragon hero until you reclass them once and level them up to snuff again. In practice I mean you won't be doing good physical damage from the moment you enter the desert until you learn Knuckle Sandwich somewhere between level 26 and 28. Which doesn't sound that bad, but martial artists level so slowly. To reach level 20 and then 26 takes more experience than it takes to beat the game. And in that scenario you'd have to be stuck with a weak link for the entire playthrough. And if you want to go to level 26 without reclassing them, I also have some bad news for you. Because reclassing ups your stats by so much that again, defense stats are balanced around that. If you go up to level 26 and then reclass, then you will have had a bad party member for again almost the entire game before that formerly martial artist starts doing damage. But the worst part to me is how redundant all of that is. If you want to do physical damage, a Paragon hero will far out damage that. And between applying zap and oomph while healing and maybe even using defensive buffs, you're not really going to have all that much time to attack with a second person. At least until post-game where you get the War Drum, an item that applies oomph to all party members. It just takes so much effort and the martial artist has so little other utility. The main things that a martial artist does have are abilities to help you hunt metal slimes and 2 disruptions. Hawkeye Claw and Critical Claim are great for metal hunting. Hawkeye Claw always hits and can crit. Outside of metal hunting, this also means that martial artists have an ability to fall back on when they get dazzled, and they have Critical Claim, which will always kill a metal slime. Metal farming is not a bigger deal in this game, since liquids are the best there are and regular enemies give relatively comparable amounts later on, but those abilities are still nice to have. The main problem is that you get Critical Claim at level 47. You'd have to grind so much to unlock the ability to farm more efficiently. It's ridiculous, and while kinda useful for post-game, well, if you don't just AFK grind, you're never getting this in the main game, and its damage will never be high enough to actually start mattering outside of metal slimes, at least not in this monster pile-on dominated meta. Then you have Disruptive Ripple at level 43, which is neat. It removes enemy buffs. A lot of enemies apply buffs, and while of course you aren't really going to make use of this to remove Zoma's bounce since you just won't have a level 43 martial artist at that point, it is not great but kinda okay in post game. And then there's the main ability, Leg Sweep, and this might sound silly since I was so harsh on Sandstorm, which seems kinda similar at surface level, but for some reason Leg Sweep works on most bosses. And single turn stunts take away a whole turn, not just a single action in this game. One of the playthroughs I did for testing featured a martial artist that reclassed to warrior and a Gardabout that reclassed into martial artist for science. And my very first playthrough featured a martial artist that I never reclassed. And near the end of each playthrough, all those characters ended up spamming Leg Sweep like there was no tomorrow. It doesn't give the greatest odds, but that was the best way for me to generate value from them. It doesn't come close to, for example, a duplicate Sage that double casts Snooze, but there are some bosses like the Bones of Barrowmouse that are immune to sleep and confusion, so Leg Sweep suddenly becomes decent. So when can you use a martial artist? Either as a class to reclass into warrior, or as a class for warrior to reclass into. Maybe an ability based class like Monster Wrangler or Sage can reclass into martial artist after learning all abilities, but that's only really post game. And I mentioned earlier that I used a Gardabout that reclassed into martial artist in one of my playthroughs. That is because of one thing that I wanted to test, which there are a lot of myths about. Luck factoring into critical rates as well as damage calculations. Even just a couple days after this game's release, players noticed something odd. High-level characters were sometimes starting to do less damage than they were at lower levels. Do enemies scale with your level and get stronger? Does your level factor into damage calculations? It was only recently that it was discovered what caused this phenomenon. Luck and wisdom related calculations are based not on your actual luck stat, but on your luck stat compared to a set number for each level. Any level 10 character will be compared to a luck stat of 22. If you have a higher or lower one, the amount of damage you do gets increased or decreased by up to 10%. This means a character with 25 luck will do 10% more damage. A character with 19 luck will do 10% less damage. Status resistances vary by 20% and critical rates can be increased by up to 3 times. But what's important is that aside from crit rates, all of those cap relatively early on. When I started doing that run, it was theorized that Gardabouts that go martial artist would do a lot of damage. But first of all, 0 times 1.1 is still 0, and secondly, this damage cap is completely irrelevant. Some people find out about this and start saying that a personality like Paragon is useless now since you will do less damage thanks to having less luck. But I let you in on a little secret. If you ever reclass, you're going to be doing 1.1 times damage. After reclassing, the number you compared up against resets back to 1 while your base luck is so much higher. So just don't worry about it. The same goes for when you learn an ability or spell. Your wisdom factors into this, but if you reclassed once, you will always get an ability as soon as possible. Anyways, crit rates do scale with your level, else low level characters would crit a lot more than higher level ones. The main thing to take away from this is that a pure Paragon character will still be above the cap where luck stops affecting your damage, just as long as you reclass once. Because of how this interacts with reclassing, everything I explained just now doesn't matter for anyone besides the hero. But the hero has so much luck that it barely matters anyways. Give your luck seeds to the hero and they'll be fine no matter the personality. Maybe add a juicy plus 50 from some elevating shoes. But what about the crit rate? Martial artists crit a lot, right? Well, mine did crit a lot. But for less damage than what my martial artist turned warrior hit for on regular attacks. And I'm not talking about a 50% crit rate here, more like 5%. Martial artists and to a lesser extent the hero have a higher crit rate than normal, and like with anyone else, it depends on your level and how your luck measures up to the number that's set for your level. At level 81, if your martial artist theoretically had 876 luck, that would result in only a 30% crit rate. That would be great in a vacuum, but I don't even know how 876 luck is possible. Even a Gadabout only goes up to 999 before reclassing. And you don't get anywhere near 400 luck from 80 levels as a martial artist, no matter the personality. So what I'm saying is that while going Gadabout will net you an insane amount of luck, and while luck has slightly more use cases than before, in practice it's basically useless and you'd much rather have more strength to start out damaging the enemy defense. The personalities I think are valid are Paragon and to a lesser extent Bodybuilder. And with those, a martial artist will eventually start hitting super hard. But again, it just takes so much effort. Every other personality will only make them take way longer until they start peaking their head above the enemy defense. 40% more strength doesn't mean 40% more attack since you also have a weapon, but it does result in more than 40% more damage in a lot of cases. You can still use them to some degree of success the way I used them in those playthroughs where I just didn't want to grind until I was far above the curve. Which means not for damage but as an item bot with leg sweep. And arguably that's the same thing you use them for if you reclass into them from a Wrangler. You only want their stamina, resilience and agility. And in those cases, those are the stats your personality should focus on. There's just one more ability I want to mention real quick, Multi-Fists at level 38, but that is all I can say about them without mentioning the class they go hand in hand with. The Warrior. I wish Warrior got Flame Slash or something. They get double-edged slash, which does 1.6 times normal damage at the cost of recoil damage, which is surprisingly okay for random encounters, but they don't get another damaging ability until level 37 where they learn Sword Dance. And Sword Dance is the best physical damage ability. It's 2.4 times normal damage, whereas Multi-Fist does 2 times damage and Cutting Edge, which you only learn at level 48, does 2.2 times damage. Cutting Edge is single target, which makes it better against random encounters, but Sword Dance is what you get first and it's what you're going to be using against the post-game bosses. I don't even want to mention all the other abilities, they're all doing less. They absolutely kill Double Up, which martial artists get. It now doesn't have term priority anymore, which is what used to make it good in old games. And that leaves only one damaging ability. Mercurial Thrust, which is a weak attack but it has term priority. And that's pretty okay in random encounters, but that leads me to Warrior's biggest weakness. Their agility is awful. And I mean so awful that you can't reasonably outspeed. Mercurial Thrust does a bit to alleviate that, but even our Bat Out of Hell Warrior won't outspeed that reliably. This makes reclassing from another class into Warrior a bit awkward. Warriors do have more bulk and access to good gear, but you'd always much rather go first and not have to risk that thwack or that desperate attack that sends you back to the last church. But the good gear is a problem in disguise for both warriors and martial artists. Since again they added a lot of weapons for martial artists, but the game is balanced around you being geared up fully. Your physical attacks just won't do much without the best weapons. They in fact need them to perform well, so you need to spend a lot of money. Monster Wranglers force you to take some time out of your day to find some monsters before they perform well, whereas both physical classes force you to take some time out of your day to find some weapons or to sell some stuff to afford better gear. But just like martial artists, warriors do have some abilities that aren't physical attacks. Pressure Pointer can instantly kill and Metal Slash does more damage to metals. Both as well as Mercurial Thrust are okay for metal farming. Whipping Boy is single target and forbearance for the entire party, allow a warrior to take attacks for other party members, but you'd much rather prevent getting hit. Forbearance can be combined with bounce, buff or even backdraft to be pretty useful, and you learn it at a reasonable level 25. Whipping Boy however is bordering on useless because it only allows you to protect one party member. I guess it's okay to use in random encounters when a specific party member is about to die, but please just kill the enemies instead. And then there's Cop Out, and I don't understand Cop Out. The ability is similar to Back Edger from Dragon Quest XI, but it deflects physical single target enemy attacks onto either an enemy or another ally. And there's not a greater way of changing enemy aggro besides putting them in the first slot of your party, because enemies are more likely to attack your party member in the first slot. But my point is that you want your warrior to take attacks, that's what the other abilities are for. But you can't use Cop Out together with Forbearance, and you don't want to deflect damage from your tankiest, strongest party member onto your weaker, squishier ones. Especially when that takes a whole action. It takes an action for not even a positive but a neutral effect. And I figured, okay, so when the warrior is the last one standing, you can use Cop Out and start deflecting all single target physical attacks. And the Bones of Barrowmouse only uses single target physical attacks. So I figured this should work, now it's time to shine. But it doesn't even deflect all single target physical attacks. I don't understand what its intended use case is yet, but it really feels like this should be usable for something. But to sum this up, warriors should have a different personality depending on what you want them to do. Tough is alright if you want someone to use Forbearance. Paragon is alright if you want someone to do hard-hitting physical attacks, and if you want to learn abilities and then reclass to martial artist, then you might want to consider Vamp or Ironclad since it allows your wisdom to stay high enough to where you learn your abilities at the regular levels. If a character is too stupid, it takes extra levels to learn an ability. And warriors or martial artists, if you want one to learn Knuckle Sandwich for that matter, run the risk of being below the curve. Not just because wisdom lowering personalities are so tempting, but also because their base wisdom is just low. I link a beginner's guide that lists all the level ranges for abilities to learn. That one also lists your luck and wisdom standard that your stat is measured up against for each level, and the exact stats gained per level for each class. Similar to how it worked with luck, if you reclass into either class, you're going to have enough wisdom either way. And again, anything above levels in the mid 30s is near the end of the main game. And those are the levels at which you learn the good abilities. And without ever reclassing, physical damage just doesn't work since it's so closely tied to your stats and since it's now hard to get strong enough to outperform enemy defense. Zap was nerfed by the way and lasts way shorter for a lower impact than in most games. Either way, I think it would be smarter to use a strength boosting personality, level either class to 20, then reclass to the other and grind like there's no tomorrow. There just isn't a pretty way to use physical attacks from anyone besides a Paragon hero. Something I'm hyping up quite a lot already. The abilities are weak for most of the game, it takes a bunch of grinding and the payoff is a very one-dimensional character. Physical attacks are the best by post-game, but it's scary that the competition with Monster Pylon is still very close after you hit an attack stat of 850. If you're completely goal-oriented and you only care about having the best party by the end, you don't care about how difficult any fight along the way is, you should still rather start with Monster Wrangler since you want to get wildside at some point. But in post-game, warriors and martial artists have like half a second in the sun. For the main game, you can afford to use one physical attacker if you don't want your hero to use physical attacks, and if you give them all your strength seeds, they will do fine. I'm really sad about what they did to some of my favorite classes from the original. The opposite can be said about the next 3 classes I want to cover. the Mage, the Priest, and the Sage. I've already lumped the first two couples together, but the comparison here is much more obvious. Sages learn the spells from both mages and priests, but they are a special class that you can only reclass into and you can only get one of them early on. A second and third follow shortly after you get Ramia, but in my opinion those come so late that it rarely matters. The three classes also have the same personality recommendations. Agility is the main priority, since going first is peak, and then stamina and to a lesser extent wisdom are nice to have. But to be honest, their stats don't really matter at the end of the day. You use them for their spells, and I do want to get more specific, so I'll start talking about the Mage, a really underappreciated class. People tend to judge it harshly for some reason. I can't understand why. I mean, probably because they work under the assumption that it's worse than a Sage and therefore not worth having, but let's just look at the Mage in a vacuum first. It's a class defined by its abilities or spells rather. I don't like starting with these kinds, besides the monster Wrangler of course, since their abilities stop scaling. Instead of gaining more attack, they get more abilities, and after reclassing, this stops. If you reclass after having just learned Crackle, that will always stay as Crackle and won't magically transform into Crackle after you collect 40 more monsters. So after reclassing, the main thing you keep are the non-damage spells like Kabuff, Decelerate, Bounce or Oomph. And one of them is not like the others. Yes, Oomph, because Oomph can be replaced by an item. Just sell your equipment, then you won't have to level a mage up to 21 before reclassing into something else. An entire playthrough with only physical damage dealers took me less than 14,000 gold worth of Oomph powder. Learning Oomph really isn't an argument for using a mage early on, especially since physical attacks aren't all that great either. And Kabuff, Decelerate, Bounce and even Fuddle aren't all that important, especially with Bounce being back to reflecting your own healing spells. Some spells I don't even want to mention, like Defizzle, which is a spell that removes spell ceiling, and the class that learns it is the Mage. So if the party member that gets bent over the most by Fizzle gets affected by Fizzle, you can't use Defizzle. There are also some utility spells like TikTok, which changes the time of day. It's basically the nightlight, but it also changes night into day, and it takes a bit longer to get. Fade is basically a fading Jenny, except you get it much later. And Click opens locked doors, but you get it at level 35, which is way past when you should have the ultimate key. And lastly, Peep, which allows you to check for mimics. None of these are really worth going mage for. I think there's no good reason to ever use a mage as a starting class, to be honest, unless you want to play without reclassing, in which case mage suddenly becomes a top contender. You won't run out of MP and the early spells just aren't that good. But what mage is good for is something to reclass into. It's something that's often ignored since sages exist, and why would you reclass into something inferior? Well, let's ignore sages for now and just look at how a mage performs after you reclass a merchant or thief. If you get them to level 20, and keep in mind mages level up very fast when compared to most other classes, you learn the first major spell, Crackle. Technically, this is also a tangible advantage that reclassing from mage to something else has for the next two bosses, but for now let's just look at this one spell. Orochi takes about 150 damage from this, and so does Garboil, since they're both weak to it. These aren't monster pile-on kind of numbers, but it's workable, and it takes barely any investment. But that's not it. At level 23 you learn Boom, which is okay against the Dying Fires. This is a bit of a low point for the mage, but also the last one, since from here on, or rather as soon as you hit level 26, Quack sweeps. It does about 200 damage to the boss troll, Barrowmouse and his soul. For the boss troll you might still only have Crackle, but for Barrowmouse it's especially effective, since you will have the duplicate head at this point. This head allows mages as well as sages to double cast any spell. This means you won't be doing 200, but more like 400 or even 600 per turn if you apply Spooky Hour beforehand. If you reach level 34, you even get Crackle, which is a straight upgrade. And finally, if you have Gefrizz at level 31, then that does really good damage against the bones of Barrowmouse and Zoma. even if you have to watch out for Zoma's bounce. If you're using a mage against the final boss, I recommend giving them the Stormlord sword, since spells cast from items ignore bounce. King Hydra is really the only boss that doesn't have a weakness to magic. But then it's also not necessarily the hardest, since you can apply plenty of stuns. And that's the main thing with mages. They do better damage than anyone else besides monster wranglers and take no setup. You don't need to go on a side quest to get the best weapon, you don't need to gather 100 monsters, you just have them and level them up a reasonable amount. Very reasonable since they level up so quickly, and then afterwards you just do good damage. This allows for a playstyle where you really don't care about anything too deeply and can beat the game in only a handful of hours without spending so much time in between bosses on prep work. They are also great for gambling addicts because of Hocus Pocus. And they do have Puff, which you can use for metal farming to some degree, or Morph, which allows you to copy another party member, which sucks because it takes up an action, but those aren't why you choose the mage. It really is about being able to not have to bother with all the prep work and to instead just cast Crack. The other class that's usable for this sort of playstyle is Sage, since that's basically just mage. So to answer the question why you'd ever pick mage over Sage, mages level faster. And if you already have to grind up 1 to 2 levels for the next spell, then you're going to have to grind 1 to 2 extra levels as a sage. It's just a tad annoying since mages need to hit certain benchmarks to function, unlike all the other classes that more evenly improve with every level. The fact that sages have slightly lower stats won't really matter. What matters more are just the abilities, or spells rather, and sages technically get more, but while having more flexibility is nice, sometimes you just don't need to learn mid-heal on one of your party members and you can function without. And lastly, I want you to move away from the mindset that mages are weaker than sages and that the two classes are therefore mutually exclusive. You can have both a sage and a mage. Go and give that a try and you'll see that there are very few instances where you want to cast 2 priest spells in one turn. What's way more common is that you want to use 1 mage and 1 priest spell or straight up 2 mage spells. One party I tried for this video reclassed into 2 sages and a mage. One sage used to be a Gardabout. If you didn't know, Gardabouts can reclass into sages. Every other class has to consume an item that you only get 1 of early on. And in that playthrough I relied on Spooky Aura to increase my spell damage before barraging each boss with offensive spells. Mostly ice ones, since that's what most bosses are weak to. And that worked really well. It was my fastest playthrough at slightly under 6 hours, even if my level was higher than with the monster Wrangler. If you don't like going for side content, I can't recommend a party similar to this enough. It transforms how the game feels. It just ups the pacing by so much. You could cut the Gardabout into Sage and instead use a Priest or another Mage, and the starting class before each of them reclassed could be switched up. There's a lot you could do differently. But what you should take away from this is that Mages enable a chill type of party. You know, the one where you don't apply oomph and don't have to buy weapons and don't have to search for monsters. Priests on the other hand are a class that I don't love as much. For the same reasons as the Mage, I don't like it as a starting class. Early game gets much harder if you have a healer instead of, for example, another monster Wrangler that kills all enemies at the start of battle. And after reclassing, you can get a Sage. But unlike with the Mage, stacking healers doesn't make you win more. It instead robs you of your win condition. They do have the same advantages over Sage that Mages have over Sages, meaning earlier abilities, but their stats aren't necessarily better. That's simply because they get so much less agility on level up when compared to mages or sages. And even just for the abilities, in practice you're never going to not use a sage over a priest. Don't get me wrong, they're effective and you could totally use a party of priest, mage and sage instead of double sage and mage. They're just a class that I rarely want to include. They just happen to very frequently be my second or third pick. Think about it like this. If you have more damage dealers, that makes your party snowball. If you kill enemies more quickly, you need less healing, less survivability and can invest more in damage. But if you have more healer, well, that's not going to get you anywhere. But what spells do they actually have? They learn the Rouge line of spells, and those are not terrible. Barrowmost, for example, is weak to wind, and you only need to hit a reasonable level 31 to learn Kiss Rouge. The main thing you use them for are the healing spells anyways. And they are not that great actually. When you learn heal at the beginning, that's worse in combat than a thief throwing a medicinal herb and going first guaranteed. Of course you can put your priest on focus on healing, but reactive healing will always be worse, even if you can make it suck a little less. The next few healing spells come at about the same time as buyable strong herbs and the hero's mid and full heal. And I'll be honest, your HP doesn't even increase that quickly. If you use a single target heal, that's already a full heal for very long. There just isn't the demand for stronger healing. Especially since I'll say it again, healing inside of combat is awful. You want to finish the enemies off quickly and then heal outside of combat. And the hero does that well enough. If you fight every battle, never flee, don't use pad foot and sell your MP restoring items, which I can understand, they give a lot of money early on. In that case maybe that second MP pool is going to come in handy, but that's a very big if. In most cases you just don't run out of MP because the game gives you so many free refills. Like on level up, it showers you with MP restoring items, and if you have a merchant they can summon an innkeeper. But for bosses you do want to heal in the middle of a fight. Well, unless you hydraulic press them into oblivion with monster pile-on. And for that, herbs really only carry you until Barrowmows. But to make this quick, multi-heal doesn't heal enough later on, and a lot of players will have omni-heal from the hero hitting level 39 by the time you get it. On sages, it can heal twice the amount thanks to the duplicate, but priests don't get that. Throughout the whole game you already have your hero that heals, and heroes tend to heal even better. Freeing up your hero is nice, but again, leave that to a sage. The hero can already revive with Zin, and you never want to use Zin or Zing in the middle of combat. Something Game 8 spread that I've heard regurgitated a few times is that apparently you want to level up priest to level 23 for Zing, but Zin is better when it comes to reviving outside of combat, and you never want to use Zing to revive in the middle of combat. Just wait until the fight is over. Outside of all the Yggdrasil leaves that you find in this game, Kazing is the only worthwhile revive spell to use in the middle of combat, even if you learn it very late and won't even get it in a lot of playthroughs. There are spells that I believe to be better than healing and even reviving though, and that is buffs, debuffs and status effects. The debuffs are just zap and kazap. They're pretty neat if you want to do physical damage, but they aren't as good as they used to be. They're especially okay on sages, which can double cast them. The buffs are insulate and magic barrier, all of which are great. And lastly, out of the status effects, Dazzle is the worst, as I explained with the thief. A sage can double cast it whereas a priest can't. Fizzle is also kind of bad, better than Dazzle because enemies can't just hit you through it. But Fizzle is no longer as strong as it used to be. You used to be able to seal away Barrowmows' magic forever, but now he recovers after one turn. Fizzle is still useful, but since all bosses, as I explained while talking about the Fog of War, don't exclusively use magic, the status effect you're really looking out for most of the time is Snooze. Snooze, after level 8, is the best spell you have. It's really overpowered, and the background footage should have done a good job at conveying that. You can replace it with a snooze stick early on, but later on, after you get the duplicate, you can start double casting it. And maybe I shouldn't have put them under status effects, but then there are also the instant kill spells. Poof, Blasto, Kamikaze and Thwag. And they are all pretty okay except for Kamikaze. I don't understand that one. Which one you want to use depends on what you're fighting, and Blasto even comes close to being mandatory for a fight in post game. You won't get any EXP if you use Blasto to remove an enemy from battle, but that's way better than taking extra damage. All in all though, I can only really recommend Priest alongside a Sage after reclassing, and even then their use is limited. I don't really recommend them for any playstyle, even if again they're more than fine. They're always fine, just never the best option it seems like. Their low agility and no access to the duplicate really make them significantly worse than a Sage. But if there's something you should take away from this, it's that you really shouldn't heal in the middle of random battles. Wasting even one action instead of clearing out enemies is only going to allow the enemies to snowball out of control by calling in more or casting Snooze or Thwag. The Garda bout. They tend to waste a lot of actions on random stuff. Their main stat is luck. Really, just from this description they sound completely unusable. But I do think they have some merit. Not for physical attackers, the Gardabout base strength is way too bad. But they learn a few neat abilities and at least their agility is okay. Not as good as Mage's, but around the same as what a Sage has. And then of course they can reclass into Sage and be totally fine. But I think that's only worth the effort if you're going for a magic based party. That is because first, 2 Sages are overkill otherwise, and second, since they get a really useful ability. Spooky Aura at level 25 makes all your spells do 50% extra damage and it lasts pretty long. If you want to do damage with spells, then this is the way to go, even if it means keeping a Gardabout in your party for a little while. Besides that, they learn Whistle, which makes farming a bit easier. It immediately puts you into battle, but by the time you want to grind you probably already have an item that does the same thing. Whistle isn't a selling point. Sobering Slap to heal status effects is neat, but you get spells that do the same and tons of items. And just like with reviving, curing an asleep party member is much worse than finishing the fight and being cured automatically. Those are the abilities that you get before level 20, but at level 22 you get Kerplunk Dance. Kerplunk, if you don't know, sacrifices yourself to revive and fully heal all others. It's an emergency button that can really come in clutch. Again, nothing necessary. An emergency option is never necessary, but I do think it's the last noteworthy ability. Anything else you just can't reasonably get before post game. You can get it, sure, but grinding so many levels is awful. Not the 33 at which you get multi-heal, but 38 you get Hustle Dance, which is weaker multi-heal. It is an ability, so maybe it's just me that's missing the Fog of War meta, but I don't think there's much merit to it. Harvest Moon is a physical attack on a Gardabout, so there's not really any way of making it work in the main game. And the same applies to Channel Anger. Channel Anger sounds like it should be neat for a magic oriented party. It increases your spell damage, but you learn it way too late at level 45. The only one that's halfway worth the consideration is Agon, which as long as you outspeed allows you to apply Master Strength, a status effect that makes you do double damage on your next physical attack to another party member. If you're going for physical damage in the main game, you'll have to grind a fair bit anyways. So a party I could imagine working is Gardabout plus Thief that both go into Sage, and one Warrior into Martial Artist or Martial Artist into Warrior. You then buff up your one Warrior / Martial Artist as much as possible and use them as your main damage dealer. That would take a lot of grinding when compared to Mages or Monster Wranglers, but it sounds okay. Going to level 31 is a pain of course, and that's all I got. It has bad synergy with Wildside, so by post game it becomes worthless. And because of their random actions, you never really want to reclass into Gardabout. And because of how easy it is to get all the luck you need just by reclassing once with any personality on any class, that makes reclassing your Gardabout into anything other than a Sage sort of useless. It makes the early game harder, but I don't think 2 Sages are worth it in most cases. The only parties I can recommend using a Gardabout for are ones that you want to end up having 2 Sages and a Mage or a Priest. In that case, Spooky Aura is worth considering, even if it takes a few extra levels, but you will also grab Kerplunk Dance as a bonus. And if you do use one, I of course recommend using them like a thief, as in you spam snooze sticks. Similarly, the main personality I can recommend is Bat Out of Hell, since lucky is just overkill. The amount of luck you get from any Gardabout is already enough for you to always be at the cap of status resistances for the rest of your life. And that leads me to the final non-hero class. The Merchant. The class that originally gets Master Strength, that you might even be able to consider reclassing to Martial Artist or Warrior since it kind of has a little bit of strength, but I don't think you should use them because of their great potential after reclassing. Merchants are the best early game class. They level very quickly, will reach level 20 in no time and have good HP, making them great Sage, Priest or Mage candidates. Kind of like a thief, except they trade utility, abilities and agility for stamina, slightly worse but still utility and an easier early game. The way they make the early game easier is with the ability Stone's Throw. It's a bit of flat damage to all enemies and its MP cost is so cheap that this becomes their basic attack. You don't need to buy them a weapon, it's just a bit of flat damage that helps your hero one-hit KO all enemies with a boomerang. Up until the pyramid, Stone's Throw combined with a regular attack from a Paragon hero or a slightly higher level hero will be enough to clear any battle immediately. It falls off afterwards, but that's fine. The only other noteworthy ability is in my eyes Service Call, which calls in a random shop, inn or church to wherever you are. It's utility that I rarely needed, but it's a neat bonus. Definitely doesn't come close to Padfoot or anything though. The other abilities are either Helicopter, a weak group targeting attack that you should never use when this game features Hypno Whip etc. And the ultimate ability Call to Arms comes way too late for it to matter. It's a weaker monster pylon that doesn't force you to go on a side quest to collect monsters, you only need to collect gold coins, and apparently it scales with level. Maybe at 99 this will outdamage monster pylon, but personally I found no use for it. They also have Dig, which I don't understand. It used to sometimes give you large piles of gold, but I don't know how it works now. Passive extra gold is also nice, but if you sell old stuff you're never going to have money problems either way. That leaves me to talk about the personalities, which should be based on what you V-class into. In most cases Bat Out of Hell is the call and Vamp can be okay. Vitality boosting personalities also have some merit, but going first is extremely important. So to make the most of a merchant, use Stone's Throw and items early on, then when you hit level 20 you immediately V-class. Merchants are great if you're trying to speed through the game. And that leaves only the hero. And while I can't give you advice on what to reclass a hero into or when to reclass into the hero, I can still give you a better understanding of how exactly you can best utilize the hero throughout the game. Since they will always be in your party, they are also to a degree what your party will be built around. So to decide how to build your party, you need to decide how to build your hero. And there are basically three approaches. One is wisdom and or agility, one is vitality and one is strength. Or rather the choice is between Bat Out of Hell, Genius and Vamp, then Tough is an option but I'm personally not the biggest fan, and lastly you can go Paragon and to a lesser extent Bodybuilder. So to make it clear, the hero gets good damaging abilities early on, elemental attacks that will most often hit some weakness. And with a hero that has a strength personality and an edge boomerang, a lot of the early game becomes trivial. They will do good damage against every boss since every boss is weak to something, and you can clear out random encounters in a second. But later on they kind of fall off. If you aren't using a Paragon, they won't do good damage against late game bosses, and even if you are, this is the point where other physical attackers and especially other classes will outdamage the hero. But at level 38 the hero learns Kazap, which is the strongest offensive spell in the game, and at level 39 they learn Omni Heal, which is the best healing spell. And combined with Snooze and Fizzle, the hero has so much utility that you can really not worry about the strength stat and be fine. Vamp is good in that regard, since it allows the hero to be okay early on and decent later on, so I recommend Vamp if you don't want to do physical damage. But the damage can be good, and that's where Paragon comes into play. The personality screws over all other stats. Your hero will have low luck and low agility, and those are very real problems. For the agility, a Paragon hero will basically need to use the Meteorite Bracer, a one-off item, well at least until post-game it's one-off, that doubles your agility. But for the luck you're going to be close to the base stat for each level that you compare to, even with the reduction from your personality. And there are two ways of fixing it. Luck seeds, which I'll be honest aren't in high demand because everyone that ever reclassed has enough, in other words everyone that isn't a hero. And then there are the elevating shoes, which give plus 50 luck if you equip them. There are also other accessories, but my point is that getting above the luck threshold is really easy and shouldn't be an argument against Paragon. The agility is more worrying, which makes Bodybuilder appealing. But if you can deal with those two minor downsides, you will be rewarded with a really easy early to mid game, and the hero will still do okay damage near the end of the game. In my opinion that's entirely worth it, and Paragon is the best personality for the hero if you're looking at the main game. If you're looking at post game though, the hero just won't be doing as much physical damage either way. So in that case I recommend Bat Out of Hell, since the hero hits 999 HP and MP either way, meaning agility is the only stat that matters. And Vamp is a neat compromise, not as good for the main game, but it's okay for post game. If you can go first and use Omni Heal or a War Drum, then the hero doesn't really need anything else. But there's still one ability left to talk about that the hero has, one that your stats don't matter for, and I'd argue that it's the best ability in the game. Kerklang. This one is absolutely broken. It has priority, meaning it will always happen right at the start of a turn, and it makes your whole party invincible for a few turns. And even on a surface level, this allows you to wait out some boss's MP pool. Garboil, for example, will waste all of its MP, and then that fight becomes trivial. Again, this is something you can always do, since the hero always learns it. And the same goes for waiting out certain attacks or buffs. But that's not all, since it also removes all negative effects from your party. You know how I said you shouldn't cure sleep, you should instead finish the fight? Well, that's true if curing sleep takes you an action, but with Kerklang you use it, then become invincible, curing all status effects from your party, and then you basically start a fresh turn. It takes 0 actions to cure any status ailment from your party. The only downside is that some bosses regenerate a nothing sum of HP. The ability is absolutely broken. Like in other games, this was limited to only being used once per fight, and I don't see people talk about it that much. Well, this is all for now. I just want to leave you with one last thought. If someone making a guide deals in absolutes and tells you that one class or one ability is absolutely required to beat this game, then either they just don't have the full picture, or they're speaking out of their own very limited experience, where that one ability was mandatory for their party, possibly because they don't know what they're doing and their party was trash. This is by far the most detailed English guide on party building that's been made so far, but it will still be outdated eventually, even if it's going to last a little longer than all the guides that have been made so far. Those are outdated right now.